Top of the morning to you and a warm welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines: Russia strikes Ukrainian air bases. Ukraine launches airstrikes on crucial Russian targets. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says Ukraine making progress with U.S. Patriot and German Iris-T defense systems. Plus, in another development, Niger coup leaders say neighbors preparing for war. Closes airspace until further notice. Thank you for joining us. Russian authorities say explosions have destroyed critical road bridges linking occupied Crimea with parts of Kherson, the region under Russian control, as Ukraine escalates its targeting of Russian infrastructure and territory. The blasts come on the day Moscow mayor said a drone had been shot down approaching the city, and soon after Ukraine struck one of Russia's biggest oil tankers with a sea drone, as well as carrying out an attack on a major naval base. The Russian-appointed acting head of Kherson region, Vladimir Saldo, says the missiles that hit two bridges in Crimea on Sunday were all Storm Shadows, an air-launched long-range missile supplied to Ukraine by the UK. Mr. Saldo says the two bridges were used by civilian and not military traffic. A rupture to a gas pipeline running alongside the bridge had cut off supplies to 20,000 residents of the city of Henichsk in Kherson. Earlier, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said a Russian-guided aerial bomb struck a blood transfusion center in the Kharkiv region on Saturday. He added that there were dead and wounded without providing any specific numbers. Also on Sunday, Russia says that its forces have hit more Ukrainian targets and repelled attacks in several directions, while Ukraine said it had launched multiple airstrikes and shelling on Russian positions, according to official briefings from the two countries. On Saturday, the Russian Defense Ministry issued a battle report saying the Russian army used high-precision weapons to wage a series of strikes through sea and aerial launches on the Ukrainian Air Force bases and completed the preset goals. Russian army repelled the Ukrainian army's attack in Donetsk, Krasny Liman, Zaporizhia, Kupiansk, and other directions, struck its command posts and other targets. Russian air defense forces also intercepted 11 HIMARS multiple rocket launches and one HARM anti-radar missile during the day. On the same day, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces issued a report saying that in the past 24 hours, the Ukrainian army continued to launch offensive operations in the directions of Melitopol and Berdyansk and had dozens of battles with the Russian army. The report says the Ukrainian army launched multiple airstrikes on the positions of Russian personnel and equipment and attacked the Russian command posts, ammunition depots, electronic warfare systems, and other targets on Sunday. In the meantime, Kiev's Air Force says Russia launched a multiple-wave overnight attack on Ukraine with 70 air assault weapons, including cruise and hypersonic missiles, as well as the Iranian-made drones. And at least 10 missiles appear to have gotten through the air defenses. Ukraine State Emergency Services released footage showing what it said was a blaze at an agricultural grain elevator for corn in Starostyan, that is Starostyan in the region between Kiev and Lviv to the west of the country, which it said was caused by one of the Russian attacks, adding that one worker was wounded. The deputy governor of the region, Serhiy Turin, said that a military airfield was among several targets and that a fire had broken out of the grain silo. Russia had earlier targeted the military airfield in the region at the end of July. Firefighters and rescue workers finished extinguishing a huge fire on Sunday at a university building in Donetsk in the Russian-controlled Ukraine. Images filmed on Saturday showed the fire was out of control An emergency minister for the Russian-controlled part of Russia's Donetsk region said the blaze started because of a Ukrainian attack using cluster munition. Now, Ukraine, which received supplies of U.S. cluster munitions last month, has vowed to use them only to dislodge enemy soldiers. There was no immediate comment from Ukraine on the alleged shelling. Both sides denied targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. President Vladimir Zelensky says Ukraine is seeing significant results thanks to U.S. Patriot and German IRIS-T defense systems, despite dozens of attacks by Russia over the past week. In his nightly video address on Sunday, President Zelensky said he had received a report on the use of advanced air defense systems received from partners, noting the Raytheon-built RTX and Patriot in Germany's IRIS-T systems. Now, President Zelensky says Ukraine had shot down a significant part of Russia's attacks over the past week, including 65 missiles of various kinds and 178 assault drones, including 87 Shaheeds. He added that Ukraine will continue internal cleansing, a reference to its ongoing campaign to impress Western partners by showing Kyiv has moved from a history of deep-rooted political corruption.
I listened to a report on the use of advanced air defense systems by our warriors, Patriots and IRIS-T systems that we received from our partners. I want to thank every country and every leader who assisted us with them. These are powerful systems, highly effective. They have already yielded significant results.
Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. Meanwhile, he visited an airfield at an undisclosed location on Sunday to congratulate airmen and women who are fighting Russia's invasion and to inspect Soviet-made aircraft carrying what appeared to be Anglo-French Storm Shadow missiles. He emblazoned "Glory to Ukraine" with a felt pen on a missile that bore a sticker with the Ukraine coat of arms at the Eiffel Tower intertwined and the French name for the Storm Shadow missile, Scalp EG, written on it. He also inspected two Western-supplied air defense systems, Patriot and IRIS-T SLMs, that were on display at an undisclosed airfield. The visit comes as Russia said a Ukrainian missile strike had damaged the Shonar road bridge linking mainland Ukraine to Crimea on Sunday. The RIA cited acting Kherson Regional Governor Vladimir Soldo, another Moscow appointee, as saying the strike on the bridge, one of the three roads links between Crimea and mainland Ukraine, involved an Anglo-French Storm Shadow missile. He did not provide any evidence. Let's switch gears for the moment to West Africa, where a crisis brews in Niger. After the coup about 2 weeks ago, the coup leaders have now closed the country's airspace until further notice, citing the threat of military intervention from their neighbors. Flight tracking website Flight Radar 24 is showing that there are currently no aircraft in Niger's skies. The West African group of countries, ECOWAS, earlier warned it will use force if President Mohamed Bazoum was not reinstated by Sunday. Now, that deadline has expired. It remains to be seen what will happen in Niger. A junta spokesman says Niger's armed forces are ready to defend the country. The military takeover has been internationally condemned, including by former colonial power France and the rest of the European Union, as well as the United Nations and the United States. However, analysts have raised concerns about a military intervention to unseat the coups.
Despite the disapproval of the people of Niger and of ECOWAS of any military intervention in Niger, the planning of this war has been carried out. Pre-deployment of forces to take part in this war has begun in 2 Central African countries. The CNSP is closely monitoring the preparations for this proxy war, for which the ECOWAS mandate was merely a conduit. The CNSP is calling national and international opinion to witness and asserts that any state from which military action is directed against Niger will be considered a co-belligerent. Faced with the threat of intervention that is becoming clearer through preparation from a neighboring country, Niger's airspace is closed as of today, Sunday, August 6, 2023, for all airports until further notice. Any attempt to violate national airspace will be met with an energetic and instantaneous response.
Now joining us is Mr. Stephen Hayes, President Emeritus, Corporate Council in Africa, former President, American Center on International Leadership, and President Cohen and Woods International. You're welcome to the program. A very good morning to you.
Thank you. Good morning to you as well.
Now, we begin with West Africa and the coup in Niger, and we can tie it into what's happening to the conflict in Russia and Ukraine proper, because the Wagner leader has already jumped on the bandwagon in comments about this coup d'etat in Niger, saying that Wagner will be happy to help the military coups in Niger against their opposition. So that puts a more delicate balance to that situation, because ECOWAS is obviously under obligation by the ECOWAS Charter to uphold Niger's democratic government. But given the situation in the West African sub-region, security-wise, economy-wise, should military intervention on the part of ECOWAS against the coup d'etat in Niger be an option on the table at this time, or at any time?
Well, the first part of your last question is the easiest. Should it be an option? Certainly, it's an option. Should that option be exercised is the question. No one, I think, should be very surprised that the Wagner Group was the first in line. I suspect that the Russians were consulted well in advance of this coup, because you're absolutely right. It is another diversion from the Ukraine-Russia war, and I suspect that the Wagner Group is only too eager to assist. In fact, if they're not in already, I'd be surprised, especially given that their involvement in Burkina Faso and Mali as well. So the three countries now being military coup-led, I think, makes a very dangerous precedent for the region, and there's a number of things that can be used as staging grounds from there. So I think Nigeria, particularly since Nigeria is by far the leader of ECOWAS, has a very difficult decision ahead of them. To do nothing reinforces the status quo, gives time for the Russians, the Wagner Group, which essentially is Russia, to back the country further and make it even more difficult for change. So I think, I think, as I said, Nigeria has a very difficult choice. Should they? It's difficult, because I think if Mali and Burkina Faso do follow up and support the coup leaders in Niger, then there's a major regional warfare. So I think a great deal of wisdom. Some people have suggested the African Union should step in. Whether they have the power to step in is another question, as always. So I think it's a tough choice. I think it's one that could go either way. If they do go in, they need to do it very quickly and successfully. Otherwise, it's going to be a protracted war. And I think Wagner would be, and I say Wagner, it's really, let's face it, it's the Russians, would be more than willing to help on that.
Mr. Hayes, the anti-Francophone, anti-French sentiment is brewing in the West African sub-region. Emmanuel Macron has said that he is ready to support the democratically elected government. Could you give us a sense of what's happening in the international power play, knowing that at the beginning of the Russian invasion, President Macron was a guest of President Putin, where he tried to stop the Russian invasion. A few months down the line, the same President Macron is supplying the Ukrainians with weapons, including very lethal Storm Shadow missiles, well, from the UK, but it was made in concert with France. And then there's the Scalp missiles from France. So do you think that there's a betrayal, from a sense of betrayal by Putin, by Macron against Putin, because he was one of the people at the forefront of the conversation to try to dissuade the Russians from attacking Ukraine. But now here he is defending, supporting Ukraine, gung-ho, no holds barred, and also supporting Niger, who Wagner, the Russian group, do not support. So do you think there's going to be a butting of heads? And do you think that President Putin feels betrayed by President Macron, even though France has European loyalties?
Well, first of all, the Russians historically have always felt betrayed by anybody. And I say it somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but historically they've always feared internal betrayal. They've feared invasion for good reason, historically. So it's not out of character for Putin to feel betrayed. I don't feel that Macron has betrayed anybody in that regard. I think he started out feeling he could be the peacemaker and moving France back into a central position globally. That has failed because it's going to be very difficult for anyone to be peacemaker with Putin at this stage. They feel their backs are against the wall. They must win. In fact, as we've said before, Putin probably does have to win if he's going to stay in power. As far as the anti-Francophone feeling in Africa, it's understandable. Historically, that's been an issue, and for quite good reason, frankly. But Niger is important to France, especially. It's provided strategic minerals, certainly the uranium. Niger provides 5% of the world's uranium. That may not sound like much, but it doesn't take much to create an atomic reactor, or, if we must, an atomic bomb. So that's an important supply. Niger is probably more important than people realize, and so I think that Macron is seeing their own strategic interest, and I suspect their uranium supply did come from Niger, are at stake as well. Now, underlying your question, does it help that France is all in on this? Yeah. It does and it doesn't. It certainly helps in terms of military force. I think it does create the impression that France still sees spheres of influence in Africa, which I think is not going to be well received. So again, we are all victims of our history, and you can't simply dismiss the history and move on. It's a very difficult situation. This whole Ukraine war has created all kinds of turnarounds throughout, where various countries started their positions have changed dramatically. I think Russia has to take a lot of responsibility for that, but they're not taking much responsibility for anything right now. Even China has shown up at the peace conference in Saudi Arabia, even though I think that's going to be a failure. A lot of people are reassessing their views. Now, I think Putin would like to bring in, create a greater war, because in fact that could bring in China, but that's another issue.
Finally, on the Niger coup d'etat, is there a danger that if it's not handled properly, the coup d'etat in Niger could cause, if there's military intervention, be used as a proxy war between using Niger as a playground and the West African nations as a playground by the international powers? Is there a danger that it could become a proxy war using Niger and other African countries should they decide on military intervention and Niger retaliates the way it's posturing to do?
It's a fair question, and it's a good question. I think that there is that danger, and I think that's why ECOWAS itself, and again that's going to be Nigeria and probably Cote d'Ivoire is the key decision makers on that, Senegal too perhaps, and why it needs to be, if there is an intervention, it needs to be Africa-led, and it needs to be a decision by Africa. I think outside of that, then yes, it becomes another proxy war. But whatever happens in Niger, if Nigeria were to take the lead, and other countries, as say ECOWAS, were to take the lead, then it needs to be done quickly, and it needs to be done decisively. Otherwise, yes, it's going to be a mess throughout the Sahel region. It will certainly reverberate on Nigeria because there'll be interest in supporting groups like Boko Haram just because to disrupt and undercut the Nigerian leadership. So, as a friend once from Russia a long time ago said, this could be a very big mess, and this could be a very big mess. I think we're in an extremely dangerous time.
Indeed. We hope that it doesn't degenerate to that level. Mr. Hayes, now to the Ukraine and the Russia war proper. It's with a heavy heart one looks at these counterattacks and attacks between both countries because it appears this violence is escalating. What are your thoughts of the state of the war at the moment?
Well, I would just underline what I just said. We're entering a really dangerous period. I'm certainly the Russians are going all out to destroy Ukraine. I don't think there's any doubt about that now. And certainly Ukraine is expanding it by hitting Russia. It's understandable given the attacks on Ukraine, but still it's going to expand the war. What does concern me is all the saber rattling by Russia and the Belarusians along the Polish border. It's almost like they're trying to draw in NATO, and it's dangerous. And also, as a fact, Ukraine would like to see NATO come in. So there may be, for different reasons, common interest in bringing NATO into this. And I think NATO is now up against the wall too, and some tough decisions. The so-called counteroffensive, which is a strange one, given that it's been advertised for months, is having a difficult time because Russians are well dug in their area. So I think there really needs to be a sit-down peace talks, but the Russians have clearly said they're not going to do that now. And say the Ukrainians have to be brought to their knees. That's not a good sign.
Tough decisions, you say. Tough decisions for Niger, tough decisions for Nigeria, tough decisions for ECOWAS, tough decisions concerning Poland and Belarus. That situation is very interesting because the Poles know that, well, I assume that they know that Wagner is also aware that any attack on Poland will turn it into a NATO war and a world war. And but can you speak to the point of the fact that President Putin the other day was mentioning how ungrateful the Poles were, drawing their attention to what happened in World War II and how, according to him, parts of Poland came from the borders of Germany as a sort of compensation because of the Nazi German aggression at that time, and saying that an attack on Belarus will be considered an attack on Russia. If you recall the conference at Yalta involving the British Premier Winston Churchill, Delano Roosevelt, the American president, and Joseph Stalin, the Russian premier, that it was at that time that the interests of Poland were upheld by the Russians. Is there any truth to that? And he said tongue-in-cheek that he was going to give them a reminder, that is the Poles, about how Russia, they owe Russia something.
Putin's selective memory is always fascinating. You recall the Russians and the Germans divided Poland in World War II. It was Hitler got part of it, right, and Russia took control of the others. And then the Polish military leadership, at least the part in the Russian area, was executed. 15,000 people soldiers were executed in the Catherine Forest by the Russians, which Russia admitted in the 1990s after Perestroika. So I'm not sure that they owe Russia a lot. I suppose that Putin could say rightly that they liberated Russia, but liberated Poland, but they also allowed the freedom fighters inside Poland to die first, to weaken the Germans, and then moved in. So I don't think there's any love lost in Poland for the Russians, but there is no way that Poland's going to invade Belarus, and that's why I wonder why they're trying to be provoked by the Russians, because the Wagner groups moved close to the border. Understandably, Poland strengthens their border with only 1,000 soldiers, but strengthens their border in fear of Wagner provoking something. So I think that I think Russia has legitimate concerns historically. I understand, but I don't support the invasion of Ukraine at all. But it's just out of question that Poland would invade. And that's why I'm concerned that Russia may be trying to provoke that to draw Belarus in closer to the war. And I think that he would love to have more Belarusian conscripts to come in to fight on Ukraine. And of course, that happens, then we're essentially in World War III.
Well, God forbid. They say discretion is the better part of valor. Which of these allies of Ukraine do you think should backpedal? And, as they say, can we all get along?
Well, that's you always ask very good questions, because backpedaling by some allies is always a concern. How can NATO stay together? That's always a question, and I'm not going to say which ones are most likely to step back. It looks like everyone's becoming much more committed, with the exception again of Hungary, and then again Turkey is playing an outlier role, but we don't know where Turkey will come out. But I think Turkey's become much more strongly attached on NATO as well. So I don't see anyone pulling back right now, but there does need to be somebody stepping up to find ways to have dialogue. But right now, the Russians, and in fairness, the Ukrainians are making it very difficult. The degree of brutality on both sides, but certainly the Russians, to what's happening in Ukraine, and also using food as a weapon is a big concern right now.
Corruption in Ukraine. President Vladimir Zelensky has alluded to as much in his saying that he's talking about an internal cleansing of Ukraine. Pre the war, with the Burisma situation involving Hunter Biden, election interference, which President Donald Trump, former President Donald Trump, was accused of at that time, even to the extent that President Zelensky was asked if he was pressured by President Trump on certain matters. Where do you think Ukraine stands as per the corruption issue? We know that in the past 2 weeks or so, high-level Ukrainian officials have been fingered for corruption. Ukrainian officials, Ukrainian nationals fingered for corruption. The Ukrainian gentleman that bought real estate in a certain European country at the beginning of the war, accused of corruption and questioned over the same. What's your understanding of the corruption issue, and how possibly President Zelensky is forthright about the cleansing he speaks of?
I wish he would use a different term than cleansing, because that brings up, and he did use that term, it brings up historic problems on cleansing both in Europe and Africa. But I think ending or limiting the corruption, I think corruption is going to exist in every country, including our own. But the issue is yes, Ukraine has had a history of corruption before Zelensky and so forth, and that was one of Zelensky's points in coming in as being very anti-corruption. Has he taken a lot of action on that till now? Not really, as far as I can tell. But the fact is, I do think he's sincere on that ending as much corruption as possible. I also think he's had a lot of pressure on that. Again, I think it exists in every country. Russia certainly has been a paradigm of corruption in some ways. It's with the oil billionaires, the tycoons, and so forth that have taken advantage of conditions inside Russia at Putin's support. On terms of, I won't dodge the question. In terms of Hunter Biden, I do think that more needs to come out on that, and a judge, and a U.S. judge, which had been appointed by President Obama, has wants more information as well. So I think we're going to hear more on that. I think, as I have said in the past, I think President Biden himself was not involved, but I do think he's guilty of bad judgment in allowing Hunter Biden to take that job while he was vice president. I think it was just really bad judgment.
But he says, sorry, Mr. Hayes, sorry to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt you, but he says that he wasn't, I think it was disclosed that he was on about 20 calls with his son, and that he didn't know that the people he was being introduced to, that is by Hunter Biden, in all the situations concerning Hunter Biden's business dealings, for which he says he had no idea, that he had no idea what was going on. Yet his son kept calling him to say hello to my pops.
Well, unfortunately, it may be possible he had no idea, and if that's the case, we're in worse shape than we fear because of his age. But is it unlikely that he didn't know what was going on? I don't know. I think bad judgment, father, son. I don't think that there's personal benefit from him per se, but I do think that he may be guilty of wanting his son to succeed a little bit more because of all conditions, the loss of the son, so forth at the same time, and all that. I don't know, but I do. What I have said in the past with you is that I think more needs to come out. I'm not against stifling that report. I think it needs to be shown. I think it needs to come out. I think we need to get answers, because I think it's going to haunt the presidential campaign if we don't, and we need to know it sooner than later.
Indeed. Time, as they say, will tell. It should tell. Thank you, Mr. Hayes.
We hope.
Yes, we do hope that. Mr. Stephen Hayes, President Emeritus, Corporate Council in Africa, former President, American Center on International Leadership, and the President, Cohen and Woods International. Many thanks for your insight and your opinions this morning.
Thank you. It's always an honor, and it's also a pleasure. Thank you.
Likewise. After the break, Russia says its forces take control of the Novoselivsky village in eastern Ukraine. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the sophomore stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. The country's defense ministry, that is Russia, said on Saturday its forces are taking control of the village of Novoselivsky in the Luhansk region of eastern Ukraine. Large contingents of Russian forces are on the offensive in the northeastern Ukraine Kupiansk sector and engage in heavy fighting, according to Ukrainian officials. Ukraine's military launched a counteroffensive in the east and south several weeks ago, but officials have pointed to an intensification of Russian activity near Kupiansk and nearby Liman, towns in the northeast retaken by Ukraine late last year. Talks on the Ukraine conflict hosted by Jeddah has concluded without any concrete action beyond a commitment to continue future consultations in favor of peace. According to a closing statement released by Saudi Arabia, more than 40 countries, including China, India, the United States, and European countries, but not Russia, took part in the talks. Ukrainians' allies have said the talks are an attempt to secure broad international support for principles that Kiev wants to be for the basis for peace, including the withdrawal of all Russian troops and the return of all Ukrainian territory to its control. Moscow called the meeting a doomed attempt to swing the global south behind Kiev, and 18 months after Russia invaded Ukraine, any prospect of direct talks between Kiev and Moscow appears remote. And now we turn our attention to the world of business and how it's affected by the Russia-Ukraine conflict and vice versa. Our business correspondent, Ini Janmekwa, is with me in the studio. Ini, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. It's it's been a very disturbing number of days, not just because the Russia and Ukraine conflict seems to be escalating by reason of the attacks and counterattacks, but
especially on the food infrastructure.
That as well. And not to forget the crisis in Niger as we speak.
That is even closer, than we would really like to.
Too close for comfort, they say. Much too close for comfort.
I heard that's what you've been discussing mostly, even on our other programs, Sunrise Daily. That's what's, because it's a disturbing thing. And the fact that ECOWAS had that deadline, which expired midnight a couple of hours ago. Now we are waiting what they will do. And we hear the coupists, of course, are not backing down. And
so what that deadline does is you put yourself in a corner with that deadline. So you box yourself in.
Yeah, so what do you do now? And there's ego to consider, there's pride, and there's also the status thing, because ECOWAS would not want to lose its face against an entity that is supposed to be legal. You understand?
It is illegal.
Yeah, it is illegal.
The coup d'etat is illegal.
It is illegal, obviously. Yeah. So, I mean, ECOWAS now losing its face against that, there could be that ego thing to pushing the challenge to say, we have to do something.
Ego should give way to common sense.
Well, the pronouncement shouldn't have been made in the first place, according to all the diplomats and experienced experts who have been talking on our shows and other programs since morning.
Okay.
It shouldn't have been that harsh from the beginning.
And to the topic of today, and Russian businesses in the midst of all this are trying to make a way for themselves. Obviously, part of the global south is Africa, and these developing countries are important to Russia. Is that why Russian businesses are visiting Africa now?
Obviously. Africa has over 1 billion market. Africa has untapped resources. I mean, even Niger, you're talking of uranium. They're still poor, unfortunately, because they are not able to develop and add value to their natural resources. Yes. You understand? So that's why. So these are the reasons why Africa seems to be so a bride at this time. The United States is looking this way. China, the newly discovered, because we've been there for a bit. China is looking this way. Now Russia, and Russia is really serious. Following that meeting that they had in St. Petersburg a couple of weeks ago. Okay. Guess what? You have Russian Export Center coming to Nigeria.
Right.
Africa, not Nigeria, Africa.
Okay.
Recongress Foundation, the State Development Corporation, Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, all Russian non-governmental organization of small and medium enterprises, among others. So you have both the government, the public sector, and the private sector coming to feast in Africa. These are the days when Africa should know its strengths, know what it's offering, and know the price it is going to pay for Russia or any other country that's coming to do business on the continent.
In practical terms, Ini, is this like a silver lining in the cloud that this conflict has opened up an opportunity, if at the end of the day this conflict is resolved, that Africa will really benefit now from Russian investment?
Yeah, it should be, Olumide, it should be, but I have to tell you that it's a very big should. Why I say that, if you are negotiating from a place of hunger or poverty, you are most likely to sell your potentials very cheap. And unfortunately, it seems that the continent at this time is very hungry and poor. Look at countries like Egypt, you understand, looking for wheat. So most likely anything that is being offered, you just grab at it without looking at the price that you're paying for it. And by the time you get comfortable, I mean, look at the issue of Niger again.
Yes.
They've had uranium, but what have they benefited? They're still they're still the poorest on the ECOWAS. Right.
Amazing.
And they are the 9th largest supplier of uranium because they negotiated from the place of poverty and desperation. So when France came or any other European country came, they just said, oh, just give us a bag of grain, we'll be fine. But what did the Europeans do with that, your unprocessed uranium that they take to their country? Later on, you buy those gadgets at very high prices. So this is what Africa should be careful. It's supposed to be, I mean, even before now, a country like Nigeria is supposed to have benefited from the export of gas. We have gas wasting everywhere, every day. And since Europe decided that they were not going to depend on Russia again, Nigeria should have stepped in. Angola at least benefited from it, from oil, you know, a bit. But Nigeria did not. Now, if Russia just comes and says, okay, we're going to do the pipeline. Remember, even in the issue of crude, up till today, we are still talking about the corruption and inconsistency in the area of crude to crude swap. Because we have crude, we cannot refine it. You understand? At the end of the day, you give crude and they say they're giving you the same thing. When you calculate it, we cannot even do a proper calculation of our crude and what we have gotten from it over the years.
One of the greatest mysteries of the 21st century.
It's not a mystery. It's just people trying to cover it up. There are people who know the answer.
It's been made a mystery.
Okay.
Russia seeks new market for dairy products. We know that agriculture is a mainstay in Russia's economy.
Yeah, so
the land mass, one of the very key advantages Russia has. But now that, well, what's happening with the cows and the milk?
The milk, yes. The cows and the milk, the dairy. Well, they are coming to Africa again.
Right.
So Russia is away from oil and gas and all those big things that we know them for. Last year, they made, I think, about $550 million from the dairy industry.
Right.
But they want to boost that. So when it comes to oil and gas, for instance, Russia has decided that they're going to cut their oil production by 300,000 barrels in the month of September. You know, it's contract, so they do it ahead. While Saudi Arabia is still cutting 1 million. So that is helping them. We see oil prices going up because of that. But, you know, outside that, they also need more money because obviously some of their customers are off their purchase list because of the sanctions and the threat of sanctions. So they're looking at dairy now. And since that's not on the sanction list, you know, because it's food and food item. So they're going into new markets, and those new markets include Africa, Morocco, South Africa, Egypt.
Right.
You know, those are the countries that they are targeting now majorly with their dairy. So what the government is doing, already the government has spent about 11 billion rubles to support dairy export.
Right.
So it was an industry that was going down before now because the exporters had issues with logistics. It wasn't very profitable for them to transport the dairy from Russia to the destination. That used to make the product very expensive.
Yeah.
So because of that, the other countries did not want to buy. So now the government is set. Remember when we talked about how they find ways to buffer some of those sanctions? So this is another one. They've said about 11 billion rubles that they're going to use to support. So what they've told the exporters is, you just make the product available, get the market. We will take care of the logistics and the costs to move it from Russia to the destination. So that makes their dairy products really cheap. So you have more people demanding for it, and of course you have more revenue going back to Russia.
Obviously, these are the ways that Russia is taking care of itself while those sanctions persist.
Yeah.
Ukraine is also not forgetting that Africa is a key hub, and also the Ukrainian foreign minister has paid a visit to Africa as well, just as the Russian foreign minister has. We hope that...
yeah, but you know, Ukraine is not in a very good place at this time, you know, to offer what Russia is offering. The war is actually happening in Ukraine. So, I mean, they're still trying to handle that and take care of their people. So it's not a very good time. What Ukraine gets or asks for most of the time now is more of assistance. They don't really have, okay, for instance, I know that UK said its businesses and its business people are going to do business in Ukraine, but people will run for their lives first. How many people will say, because I want to do business and I have empathy for a country, then I'll go into the country even in the midst of war? You know,
Exactly.
when you're not sure of your life, landmine threats, the Black Sea is closed or is now endangered.
There's no security.
No security, nothing to assure you. So you know, Ukraine unfortunately doesn't have a whole lot to do. And I think last week we did talk about the resilience of their farmers in spite of all of this. So they're really trying and also looking for ways to buffer some of the impact, especially with the assistance of, you know, the West and all of that. But they cannot offer what Russia is offering at this time.
We look forward to a day that they can in the future, where Ukraine and Russia side by side at the end of this war will coexist, and Africa will become a new bride and not just, as they say, a chick on the side.
Exactly.
Or the side chick of Russia.
I don't know about the chick on the side.
Well, it happens all over the world. Ini, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
When we return, journey to freedom, Ukrainian orphans taste freedom after fleeing Russian occupation. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back to the final stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Japan on Sunday marked the 78th anniversary of the U.S. atomic bombing on Hiroshima, where its mayor Kazumi Matsui urged the abolition of nuclear weapons and called on world leaders' notion of nuclear deterrence folly. A peace bell tolled at about 8:15 a.m., the local time in that country, the time the bomb was dropped. About 50,000 participants in the outdoor memorial ceremony, including aging survivors, observed a moment of silence. Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and other participants took part in a wreath-laying ceremony. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima on August the 6th, nicknamed Little Boy, killing thousands instantly, and about 140,000 by the end of the year. Japan surrendered on August the 15th. Meanwhile, in New York, a small group of anti-war activists held a protest at Times Square in New York on Sunday to mark the 78th anniversary of the U.S. atomic bombing on Hiroshima. The day to commemorate the victims of the world's first nuclear attack comes as Russia has raised the specter of using nuclear weapons in its war with Ukraine. The activists held posters demanding NATO stop its support of Ukraine and marched to the Hudson River, where they protested in front of the U.S. anti-aircraft carrier Intrepid, used in World War II, which currently serves as a museum. And Pope Francis closed an international festival of Catholic youth with a huge outdoor mass and his own I Have a Dream speech, saying it was for world peace, especially for Ukraine. About 1.5 million people attended his closing mass at a riverside park in the Portuguese capital, the Vatican disclosed, quoting local authorities. Sunday's mass was celebrated by 700 bishops and 10,000 priests who distributed communion to the huge crowd. Many of the faithful slept outdoors, having attended a vigil there on Saturday night. They gathered in sweltering heat. Speaking after the mass, the 86-year-old France Pope urged the young people to take the fraternal experiences of the six-day jamboree back home and apply them to their daily lives. The Pope, who was returning to Rome on Sunday evening after an event to thank volunteers of the World Youth Day Festival, met a delegation of 15 young people from Ukraine during his trip. Finally, after nearly a year and a half locked away in hiding under Russian occupation, followed by a daring escape last month, a 16-year-old Ilona Pavlovic could hardly believe it was okay to just stop and play. Her ailing father had kept Ilona and her brother Maxim, who's 15 years old, hidden in the house since the Russians came to their village, Pishani, in the south bank of the Dnipro River, the south bank of it, at the start of the invasion last year. At a hostel in Kiev, Ilona recounted that she couldn't go anywhere because her father was worried. He said that the Russians could rape her or kill her, as there, according to them, had been such cases. Last month, their father finally died of an ailment, the same illness that killed their mother a decade ago, leaving them orphans. President Vladimir Putin claims to have annexed Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine. Moscow says it has gathered hundreds of thousands of orphans and vulnerable children there. That's it for today's special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay.